Two antiviral drugs look to be among the first set of effective oral treatments for COVID-19, essentially to keep people away from hospitals. For more, I have Dr. Kim Seung-taek from Institute Pasteur Korea. Welcome back, Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon.
I also have Professor Howard Lee from Seoul National University. Pleasure to have you back, Professor Lee.
Thank you.
Dr. Kim, we'll start with you. Let's begin with a look at the reported efficacy of the two antiviral pills against COVID-19 by Merck and Pfizer.
Well, first of all, I have to talk about the some drugs that are actually being developed or being used right now. The COVID-19 actually two different phases, or sometimes we call the periods. So the first phase is virus replication phase. So in this case, the antiviral drugs, which actually block the virus replication, could be very useful. But in the second phase, this is an inflammatory phase. So in this case, the very excessive immune response actually damages our body, not the virus replication. So the represented drug in this phase is the dexamethasone, some steroid drug. So the drugs that we are actually talking about right now is the Merck drug and the Pfizer drugs actually belong to the some antiviral drugs, which actually act against the virus replication. So these drugs, although these two drugs actually are acting on the viral application, the mechanism of these drugs are very different. So basically, just the Merck drug actually this is actually just mimicking the some building block of the some viral the RNA. This is the genetic material. So when they incorporate into the some viral RNA, then actually just mess up all the genetic information of the viruses. That's how these antiviral drugs work. But in the case of the Pfizer drug, when the virus enters the cell, the virus actually produces a viral protein to play any viral function. But this protein is actually produced by not in the individual protein, but as a big chunk. So this big chunk of protein has to somehow be processed by some special enzyme called the proteases. This protease is very effectively blocked by this Pfizer drug. So mechanism is very different. But anyway, according to some very recent phase 3 clinical trials, these two drugs are very effective against the blocking the transition to the some severe COVID-19 by the 50% for the Merck drug and the 89% of the Pfizer drugs. And then these are drugs actually eligible for the obviously it's mild and moderate COVID-19 patients with at this point is with some high risk factors. And then since I just told you this is antiviral drugs, so this has to be used very early phase of the COVID-19 disease. So based on this clinical trial, these drugs has to be used at least within the 5 days of the symptom onset. So that's the sort of just a summary for the two drugs so far.
Right. And Professor Lee, both Merck and Pfizer have reportedly shared clinical trial results that Dr. Kim just mentioned in press releases and not scientific articles. So accordingly, some critics are saying there is insufficient data. What are your thoughts?
Those concerns arose primarily because only interim results have been available up to this point. But that's not without a reason. In the clinical trials sponsored by both Merck and Pfizer, their oral pills showed overwhelmingly super efficacy profile against placebo. So with those results, the Independent Data Monitoring Safety Committee, in collaboration with the FDA, the U.S. regulatory agency, asked the companies to stop further enrollment of patients into those clinical trials because with those overwhelmingly superior efficacy of those pills, it's not ethical to enroll additional patients into those trials. When it comes to short-term safety profile, also there was no difference between the pills and placebo, which is a good sign. But when it comes to long-term safety, there is still a concern, particularly for molnupiravir by Merck, because as Dr. Kim summarized, it can be mutagenic. In other words, it can increase the risk of mutagenesis, in other words, mutational risk. But nobody knows whether that turns out to be true or not. Still, to me, the benefit clearly outweighs the risk, and the risk-benefit ratio will be meticulously scrutinized by the U.S. regulatory agency, FDA. So that's where we stand.
Right. Keeping in mind what Professor Lee has just said, Dr. Kim, what are your thoughts on these two antiviral pills serving to perhaps change the course of our fight against COVID-19?
I think just based on the efficacy and the safety, the data that we have right now, it could just substantially just affect the some course of the pandemic right now. Well, in just under the condition that we have a very just enough just a supply of these the drugs, and then and if we can somehow just solve the some cost issues. So the so that's the main issues. And then sometimes we actually just compare these two drugs to the Tamiflu. This is actually used for the influenza infection. And then Tamiflu is also antiviral drugs, which means it's actually inhibited virus replication. But the mechanism is actually a little bit different for Tamiflu. The Tamiflu actually inhibits the secretion of the virus from the infected cells. So those three drugs actually just inhibit the very different steps of the virus life cycle. But in terms of antiviral drugs, they are very same. And then those have to be used within certain just time after the symptom onset. So currently the issue is that some access issue, which is actually involves in the mass production and also cost issues. In the case of Tamiflu, when some people just experience some symptoms, well, people kind of just easily just access this Tamiflu. We actually got the prescription, then get some drug from the pharmacy, then can actually take it very just easily. But for these two drugs, I think in addition to the cost issues, mass production is also issue. So currently, the target of these antibiotic drugs for a while, it would be the patient with the mild and moderate COVID-19 with high risk factors.
Right. And keeping in mind the issue that Dr. Kim has just mentioned with regard to supply, Professor Lee, both Merck and Pfizer therefore have licensed their drug to generic drug makers and for supply to low and middle income countries.
Right.
What do you believe are the implications of this latest move?
It's huge. While patents are still in effect, no company is allowed to make generics. That's a current legal system. So the agreement agreed upon between Pfizer and the MPP, or medicinal patent pool, signifies that Pfizer has decided to forego any royalties on sales that will occur in all of those countries covered by the agreement. That means more than 50% of people in the world can get the drug at a much cheaper price.
Right. And stay with Pfizer, Professor Lee. Pfizer, however, has refrained from granting a similar license for its COVID-19 vaccine. How do you explain its shift in stance with regard to its antiviral pill?
That's a very interesting question. I think that's both a humanitarian and scientific decision. The vaccine is a biologic, so not every company can manufacture it with a sufficient level of quality, even though Pfizer allows the company to do so. This can lead to a significant drawback in the efficacy, safety, and performance of any vaccine. Logistics, such as cold chain, is another issue. In contrast, however, oral drugs are relatively easy to manufacture with a sufficient level of quality at many places in the world. Additionally, logistics is not a big hurdle for oral drugs as long as the stability is ensured.
Right. And staying with the manufacture of these generic versions, Dr. Kim, could you walk us through the process?
Well, the process is generally the technology transfers just can be made between for example, like Merck or just Pfizer to other just pharmaceutical companies just making some genetic medicines, and then generally this is all just a chemical synthesis. Some organic chemists do this kind of job. So this is some large scale, not laboratory scale. So since it is a large scale, some factory scale, there might be some specific some instruction from the Merck or Pfizer to some genetic producing pharmaceutical companies.
Right. And how do you respond to calls, Dr. Kim, for a further expansion of this license deal to more countries, to include others like Brazil and Mexico?
Well, I think ideally it would be much better to just expand the scope of just a license to probably many more and more countries. But in the end, some the companies they are actually considering that just a profit because they invested a lot of money for this development. So we have to actually just consider. But for those countries with the just hard hit by the COVID-19 right now, I think those countries, first of all, they have to just consider seriously more just the vaccination first. Because the vaccine is much cheaper and much more affordable than the oral drugs right now. And then they have to just think about just oral drug options.
Right, I see. Professor Lee, under the royalty-free license, as you mentioned, that has been granted by both Merck and Pfizer, some 100 low and middle-income nations that, like you mentioned, account for over half of the world's population will have access to affordable COVID-19 medication. Having said that, what now are the tasks that need to be tackled to allow for an effective treatment campaign in these countries?
Those oral pills should be taken within 3 to 5 days after a COVID-19 case has been confirmed. That means the availability of accurate and reliable diagnostic measures, such as PCR, is indispensable. Well, in that sense, Korea is lucky and far advanced in this arena. However, dispensing is another issue, since the beauty of those oral drugs is the capability that they can be taken orally at home. But under the current dispensing system in South Korea, patients should go to a local drugstore to get the drug, which is not possible in case of COVID-19 patients. So, hospital dispensing should be allowed, or some sort of telepharmacy has to be made possible.
I see. Meanwhile, Dr. Kim, you've kept us quite updated on efforts by local companies to develop their own COVID-19 antiviral pill. What are the latest on such efforts?
Well, some companies actually just trying their sort of just antiviral drug candidates on the phase 3 clinical trials, and others actually just drop their drug candidates after finishing the phase 2 clinical trials. And one of the reasons is that, just recently, one of the global big pharmaceutical company, the Roche, also they just failed to just achieve their primary goal of the antiviral drugs, which is called AT527. The mechanism of action is very similar to molnupiravir, but they failed. And then when I actually reviewed the results of those phase 2 clinical trials, well, number one is actually just the number of just participants. I mean, just for enrollments for these clinical trials is pretty small. This is phase 2, just 100 or 200 people. And then in this those drugs, actually, in order to just maximize the drug efficacy, they have to very carefully design their clinical trials. Because most like some young people with some mild COVID-19, well, they would just spontaneously recover. But most of the some very successful the clinical trials that also achieved by the Merck and Pfizer, they actually just targeted only just the mild and moderate COVID-19 patient with the high risk factors. So in this case, there are just groups of people who received the drugs, and the other groups of people who received the placebo. In the end, there's they could obtain some very significant statistical power to demonstrate the antiviral efficacy of such drugs. So considering those kind of things, I think some companies are still just submitted their some modified phase 3 clinical trials, and then they got approved for such a trial from the Korean FDA, and then they are still now on the some phase 3 clinical trials. Those trials are ongoing right now.
Right, so advances are being made.
Sure.
And Professor Lee, what can you tell us about the importance of having a homegrown drug and perhaps the hurdles that need to be overcome in this development process?
The current pharmaceutical industry has not played a leading role on a global scale before. So it's not unusual or unexpected to see them lag quite behind global pharmaceutical companies in developing oral treatments against COVID-19. But don't get me wrong, I'm not underestimating the potential and capability of the Korean pharmaceutical industry. Still, there is a silver lining and competitive edge for a follower. For example, the compound by Arirang, a South Korean company, can be taken once a day orally, whereas the pills by Merck and Pfizer should be taken 3 to 4 times a day. So that means a lot of convenience in terms of patients' compliance. And it is my understanding that performing clinical trials in patients with COVID-19 in South Korea is cumbersome and difficult, if not impossible, particularly for those with early disease. And this is the target population of oral drugs. It is because any newly diagnosed COVID-19 patients will be directly sent to a regional treatment center where physicians and clinical people with the expertise and experience in clinical trials are very scarce.
I see. And Dr. Kim, Celltrion's Recurena was recently approved by the European Union. How does this monoclonal antibody treatment compare to the antiviral pills that we have?
Well, first of all, as I just said earlier in this the discussion, the monoclonal antibody is also sort of just antiviral drug because this inhibits the virus replication cycle. But the steps of the virus life cycle is completely different. In this case, the key element, whether it is a monoclonal antibody or sometimes we talked about some convalescent plasma, the key element is the neutralizing antibody. The main the function of the neutralizing antibody is actually block the virus entry to the cells, which actually just inhibiting two different proteins from the virus and also the protein from the cell. So this monoclonal antibody is basically just inhibits the some early phase, it would just play a role in the early phase of the COVID-19. And then actually one of the so kind of just advantage of these monoclonal antibodies against the some oral drugs is as of now for this Recurena, the cost is much more affordable than oral drugs. Well, usually just monoclonal antibody is very expensive. But in this COVID-19 pandemic, I'm not quite sure about the cost of the some other monoclonal antibodies produced by produced in the companies in the U.S. right now. But at least in Korea, it's much more affordable than the oral drugs right now. And also, I want to just mention the safety issues. The monoclonal antibody, this is antibody, this is a protein. So compared to some chemical drugs, the safety is much better, much more tolerable than any chemical drugs. And then one about the some disadvantage of this monoclonal antibody is, well, this is antibody, and this has to be administered by the IV injection. This is not in the outpatient setting. This is a hospital setting. But the good thing is this can be only just one IV injection is enough. But compared to the oral drugs has to be taken now. Just the Merck drugs and the Pfizer drugs have to be administered 5 days consecutively. Although it is much convenient, I mean, it can be taken by orally. So one of the advantages of this the Celltrion monoclonal antibodies, we already have in our hands. So now just the number of severe COVID-19 patients is increasing in Korea right now. And with these monoclonal antibodies, we can actually effectively control the number of severe COVID-19 patients because according to many clinical trials on the monoclonal antibody, including just Celltrion's monoclonal antibody, this is quite effective just preventing the progression to severe COVID-19 by 70 or the 80% of drug efficacy.
Which currently would be higher than molnupiravir, which is 50.
Compared to molnupiravir, yeah, it's higher, but a little less or just comparable to the Pfizer drug. So since we have already these monoclonal antibodies in our hands, maybe some experts, and including me, we actually suggest that maybe expanding the use of monoclonal antibodies to make just more people with some potential high-risk factors.
Right, I see. And Professor Lee, Korea has reportedly secured 400,000 courses of the antiviral oral treatment, which will be available hopefully early next year. In the meantime, what do you propose to ensure a safe and sustainable transition into a new normal?
That's simple. Two things. Number one, vaccine is still the main weaponry against COVID-19. So don't delay getting your jabs and booster shots behind the schedule. Number two, social distancing and wearing a facial mask are something that we still need to stick to. The pandemic is not gone yet.
Right, that is true. So vaccinations and face masks.
Yep.
All right, Professor Lee, as always, thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you.
And Dr. Kim, thank you very much for your thoughts and your time.